Welcome to CC Writes. My name is CC Lepke, and today we are writing in space. The worst story that I ever read, which I will not name here because that would not be very nice, did something that a lot of writers are guilty of early on in their careers. It jumped from one plot point to the next without giving the story time to breathe. Bad pacing means that a story lacks two important qualities that all writing should have: structure and space. I talked about structure in a previous video about how to pace a story the easy way. Check it out if you'd like a refresher. But today we're going to focus on how to add space into your prose so that you won't experience the pitfalls of bad pacing. In art, there are three types of space that can be used: positive space, negative space, and three-dimensional space. Positive space refers to the subject of the work, and this terminology remains consistent even if the subject of your work is a jerkface. Negative space is the environment around or in between subjects. The less space between subjects, the more spicy the image. Three-dimensional space is the illusion of depth that's created within the work. Illusion. Your writing can benefit from each of these art techniques as they apply to writing prose. In writing, you have one or multiple subjects, your characters. Characters are your positive space. When you describe their looks, their actions, and their dialogue, you're creating positive space within your work. However, your characters must also exist within and interact with an environment, unless you want your readers to think that your characters exist within a void of absolute nothingness, in which case, you do you, bruh. But for everyone else, the world your character lives in is your negative space, which encompasses every time you turn the focus away from your characters to perceive the environment, politics, religions, or other systems in the world. Three-dimensional space in prose is created through the perception of the self and the world through the lens of your subject. Anytime your character sees something in their environment and thinks, believes, or feels something about it, or when they focused inward to contend with their sense of self, you are creating three-dimensional space. In writing, the rules about what makes something three-dimensional are a little different. It's kind of like the person that you got set up on a blind date with. It's more about personality. The combination of positive, negative, and three-dimensional space in your writing affects the tension of your story. Imagine your reader's interest in your story is a rubber band. When you create positive space in your story, you're taking each end of the rubber band and you're stretching it tighter and tighter. If you keep pulling continuously, the rubber band is going to snap. Negative space releases the pull on the rubber band. But if the pull is released too much, the rubber band's going to be limp. Ideally, you want to retain a little bit of tension on your rubber band that slowly increases throughout your story. At moments, the tension should spike and then release a little bit. This makes it so that you can ramp up the tension in your story without overwhelming your readers. Three-dimensional space is really interesting because it can be used to increase, decrease, or maintain the level of tension throughout the story. If feelings are heightened, then three-dimensional space can carry on that feeling of anxiety for a while. When the story needs a moment of relaxation, three-dimensional space can enhance a feeling of peace, tranquility, safety, or whatever other neutral feeling you're trying to convey. Three-dimensional space ostensibly relies on the other space around it to give it meaning. However, it is possible to use three-dimensional space to relay subtext within a scene that conflicts with its surrounding space. If you want to master space within your story, then you're going to need the right tools to make it work. As with all of the fundamentals of prose, intent is everything. Before you ever start to write, you need to have an idea of what you're trying to get out of your story. Is it supposed to be action-packed, reflective, gut-wrenching. How you use the space in your prose changes how it's going to be perceived. So to create these feelings in prose, we use action, reaction, and scene. Action is a function of positive space. With action, the story moves more quickly and the tension grows. Consider this. Harold pounded on the storm door with his clenched fist. May flung the door open wide. They glared at one another, teeth set on edge. Without saying a word, Harold held up a photo of May's dog pooping on his lawn. May ripped the photo out of his hand, but Harold smirked. I have more. The HOA will hear about this. Just you tell them, you old shrew, May hissed. I'm sure they'd love to hear about that pot plant you keep in the garage. I have a condition, Harold stuttered. His face paled and he clenched his fists again. Yeah, it's called chronic stupidity, May jeered. This segment is composed almost entirely of action. That is to say, it's composed almost entirely of the physical actions and dialogue between Harold and May. You'll notice that the segment happens quickly. There's a sense of urgency to the writing. Even something as seemingly mundane as two crotchety neighbors arguing over a dog defecating on the lawn becomes intense because of action. Reaction is a function of three-dimensional space. It can be like hitting a pause button on your story to give your reader time to reflect on what's happening. Reaction in the story of Harold and May can increase the anxiety in the scene simply by extending out the perception that Harold and May have of what's going on. We'll rewrite the first paragraph as an example. Harold pounded on the storm door with his clenched fist. Hitting the door so hard made his fist sting, but it complemented the fizzling rage that seethed beneath his skin. May flung the door open wide. They glared at one another, teeth set on edge. What Harold wouldn't give to never have to see the grisly old woman's withered face ever again. Without saying a word, Harold held up a photo of May's poor excuse of a dog pooping on his lawn. He wouldn't have believed such a ratty little thing could leave behind something so large, but as they say, a picture is worth 1,000 words. May ripped the photo out of his hand, but Harold smirked. He had her at last. He'd won. I have more. The HOA will hear about this. Using reaction, we're adding in the undertones of what's going on in the character's head. By doing this, we're extending the interaction without removing any of the tension. The pace of the segment is a bit slower, but the enmity between the two characters is intensified. Funnily enough, we can also use reaction to take the wind out of the scene and create a completely different subtext. Harold pounded on the storm door with his clenched fist. His heart pounded and his arms shook as he waited those few breaths while her heavy footsteps pounded down the hall. May flung the door open wide. They glared at one another, teeth set on edge. Words failed Harold as he looked at her luminous face. She was lovely when she was irate. Without saying a word, Harold held up a photo of May's dog pooping on his lawn. She always got so irritated when he complained about her dog. The way her brow wrinkled and her lip curled sent shivers down his spine. May ripped the photo out of his hand, but Harold smirked. I have more. The HOA will hear about this. God, he loved it when she looked at him like that. Harold loved a woman with spirit. The story's a lot different now, isn't it? Instead of two feuding neighbors, we have an old man who relentlessly teases the woman that he has a crush on because he likes her fiery spirit. If you need to release the tension in your story, then you can use scene to create negative space. Scene looks at the background, the environment, or the world. It takes the focus away from the characters and their problems. It's sort of like a wide shot in a movie where the camera zooms out and you get a bigger idea of what's going on in the world. Let's say at the end of Harold and May's interaction, we want to drop the tension a bit. I would do it by creating a transition between the close-up action and the wide view angle of the world that they inhabit. Yeah, it's called chronic stupidity, May jeered. Harold took a few steps back off of the porch, fumbling for a retort. Around him, lawnmowers growled and the dogs behind the tidy white picket fences took turns barking. A jogger in tight yoga pants trotted down the street, engrossed in the peace and safety of the neighborhood. Harold looked around as if desperate for an ally in his fight, but found no one. The air went out of him. Just keep your dog off my lawn, May." That said, he turned and walked back toward his house, sulking like a child the entire way. It looked like it was time to hide his weed. You'll notice in this part that I started with a tight focus in on Harold and then zoomed out to his immediate surroundings to juxtapose his argument with May from the relative peace of the rest of the world. Finally, I zoomed back in on Harold as his emotions transformed from anger to defeat. The transition between Harold's emotions was easier because I could put it in context of the world that didn't necessarily care about his feelings of anger, which forced him to change. Using action, reaction, and scene to affect the pacing of your story is something that you're going to have to contend with throughout the entire writing process. There is never a time when you won't have to consider the pace of your writing. Because this is true, you need to think about what's most exciting, what's most important, what needs to be emphasized, and when your readers will need a break. Unfortunately, the answers to these questions are not exactly intuitive. I hate to say that it depends with something like this, but the nature of space in art is that sometimes a lot of one type of space is a really good thing, but other times it's a really bad thing. I like to think of my writing as if I'm directing a movie. If I'm writing a fight scene, I want it to be fast and tense. So I use more action with maybe a little bit of reaction here or there. If I want a character to come across as distant, unresponsive, or reflective, then I'll use a lot of scene and reaction. The more disconnected I want the character to feel, the more I'll emphasize scene over reaction. If a moment in my story is supposed to be uncomfortable, I use a healthy mix of action and reaction. So yeah, it depends. But it depends mostly on you and how you want your readers to experience the story. And now for my favorite part, redlining. I cannot emphasize enough how much easier it is to know when and where to use space in your writing when you have real-life examples to study. Once again, I'm going to redline my own story, Fine, to show you how redlining works. I picked 3 different colors to identify whether the space used is positive, negative, or 3-dimensional. As I went through, I figured out which sentences were about action, reaction, or scene, and colored them accordingly. Afterwards, I added notes to each paragraph to identify the relative speed and tension. When I was done, I had a nice little guide to show how the pacing and mood changed over time. If you want to practice actively writing space rather than just identifying it in somebody else's work, I recommend doing what I did today with the Harold and May example. Write out a brief scene using only action, then rewrite it using action. Finally, pick a paragraph and try to drop the tension in the scene. I picked the last paragraph, but you can use whatever paragraph you want. Try dropping the tension a couple of times and then picking it back up as the story progresses. It should help you learn the transitions between space that can make your writing a little bit less jarring. And that's it. If you master the technique of adding space into your writing, it can have a huge effect on how your writing lands with your readers. If you've been following along in the series, then you will know just how important it is to get a grasp of the fundamentals of writing prose. Line helped us form clarity, shape made it easier to guide readers through our story, value provided emotional weight, and space helps us change the tension. Next time, we'll go over how to add texture to your prose by creating visceral descriptions. I hope you found my advice about adding space into your prose helpful. If you'd like to check out more lessons from me about improving your pacing, check out the video on top. Or, if you're brave, click on the bottom video to see what YouTube recommends. As always, thank you so much for joining me today on CC Writes, and I will